Hey, hello everybody. We'll get started whilst people are still entering the webinar. Welcome to the Critical Curriculum Climate and Diversity webinar, the first in a series of webinars exploring the critical issues of our day. My name's Beth and I'm a Programmes Officer here at A New Direction. I'm a white woman in my late 20s and I have long brown hair and I'm wearing quite a bright blue jumper. In today's webinar, there will be a panel discussion followed by a Q&A. Please use the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen, to pose any questions that you have, as they tend to get a little bit lost in the chat. You can also use this Q&A function to like and upvote questions, and then they're more likely to be asked. And we will try and get through as many questions as we can. The chat, as some of you are already using, will also be open throughout the webinar. So please do use this to introduce yourselves and to also let us know if you've got any problems. This webinar is being recorded and this recording may be used on our websites and on our social media and may also be used on our partners' platforms. Closed captioning is available as well through this webinar through Otter AI, and that can be accessed using, there should be a button above my head that you can access the captions through there, and do let us know if you would like any support in accessing this. Before I introduce you to our wonderful panelists, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about A New Direction and why we are hosting the webinar today. We are A New Direction, an award-winning non-profit organisation working to enhance the capacity and agency of children and young people in London to own their creativity, shape culture and achieve their creative potential. This webinar is part of our Teaching for Creativity programme. We at A New Direction believe that creativity is an essential skill that can be taught, and it is vital for supporting both teachers and young people to navigate these changing times. However, we recognise that space for creativity within the curriculum is not always made or is consigned to more arts-based subjects rather than used across the curriculum. Using the 5 creative habits of mind, imaginative, inquisitive, persistent, collaborative and disciplined, we believe that it is possible to embed creativity in all subjects and in turn work to broaden and diversify the curriculum as a whole. In today's webinar, we will explore 2 critical issues, climate and diversity. Led by Dame Alison Peacock, today's speakers, Teme Ekindele Barker from Inclusion Labs and Paul Turner from the Ministry of Eco-Education will discuss making space in the curriculum for these essential subjects and the challenges of fitting this into an already crowded timetable. So, without further ado, I will hand over to Dame Alison Peacock.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening, and I'm looking forward to leading a conversation with my colleagues about these important issues. We're going to be thinking about climate and diversity and how we can take a creative approach to making sure that these really vital areas of the curriculum are included across all of the curriculum all of the time. They're just really important things that we don't sideline, that we don't say, well, it's Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Now's the time we think about diversity, or now's the time we think about the future of the planet. This is about how we engage in these issues across the piece. And I want to share with you some key dispositions that came from my own research with colleagues into what's known as Learning Without Limits, an approach to leadership, an approach to teaching and learning that seeks not to label anybody, to make sure that we always maintain the opportunity for children to surprise us with what they're capable of. It's surprising how many classrooms don't do that. So making sure that we always give children the opportunity to surprise us. And the dispositions are these. The first one is a notion of empathy. We need our schools to be places where the culture is one of building empathy. What is it like to be a child learning in this school? What's it like to be a parent waiting to meet with one of the teachers from this school? What's it like to teach in this school? What's it like to work here? That notion of empathy, how do we understand what it feels like to be in someone else's shoes? And that's the first really important disposition that I'm sharing with you at the moment. Another disposition is one of generosity. So how do we take a generous view? How do we take a generous view of our community? When people make a request, do we think about that through the lens of empathy? Do we think, why might they need to be asking that? What can I do to help? Or do we go down the road of, well, you know, who do they think they are bothering me at this time of day? So it's all around culture And that culture of generosity is about accepting and embracing difference. It's about thinking, actually, what can we do differently, and how do we enable that sense of innovation? How do we keep growing and developing what we're doing in our school, rather than just thinking everything's stuck? We need to work to develop a culture of emotional stability. We know from the work that the Children's Commission has done most recently into asking children about their opinions during the pandemic, that many, many children are incredibly worried about the future of the planet. So we can't, in my view, sideline that and say, well, that's not something we're going to talk about because it's not on the main part of the curriculum. This is a real concern. It's a life concern for everybody. It needs to be something that is engaged with across the piece. So that notion of emotional stability, where it's safe, where children feel safe to ask questions and to say, well, can we learn about this? And an environment where colleagues feel safe to be able to question what's being suggested. So you've constantly got a sort of dialogic environment where everybody's ideas are being celebrated and welcomed. Inventiveness is so important. And we've already heard about, these habits of mind that really matter. Being able to be inventive is about being able to find a way through. So whatever the problems are, whatever comes our way, whether we're school leaders or whether we're teachers or support staff, it's about how do we find a way of engaging this child, or how do we find a way of supporting this family or supporting this parent? So finding a way through, inventiveness is really important. And inventiveness, of course, is about an approach to learning that is constantly about saying, well, what else can we do? How else can we approach this? Really importantly, I think the disposition of openness is fundamental to how we build creative schools where creativity is at the heart. Because if you have a sense of openness, then you are ready to be surprised. You're ready to embrace new ideas. You're ready to think differently, to be able to go with the flow. So being open is complete opposite to being fixed and everything stuck, and that's the way it has to be. We need to be persistent, because none of these things are necessarily straightforward and easy. So how do we develop persistence in our learners, in our colleagues? If we decide that we've got a particular vision, how do we keep on trying at that vision? And then finally, a sense of questioning and humility about everything that we do, everything that we offer, and beyond the formal curriculum at school, the informal curriculum, the whole experience of what it feels like to be part of a school community. So offering some humility around that, I think, is also really important. Now, I'm really fortunate this evening to be joined by two colleagues who are going to help us think about what it means to embrace thinking about climate, thinking about diversity across the whole curriculum. And the first of these colleagues I'm going to come to is Paul Turner from the Ministry of Eco-Education. So Paul, can you give us a 5-minute spiel on what you offer and how you're going to approach all of that this evening? Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. So hello everyone, my name is Paul. I'm the education lead for the Ministry of Eco-Education. I'll just describe myself. I'm a white male, short brown hair, mid-30s with blue glasses and a grey jumper. So until about 2 years ago, I was a secondary geography teacher. I was the head of department, had been head of department for quite a while. And I'd gradually got more and more interested in climate change education and the evolving world, particularly social movements in public spaces who were beginning to change the rhetoric and were shifting the conversation. And I felt like as a teacher, I needed to respond to that, and I needed to acknowledge what was happening in the wider world. And so I reached a point, and actually I think it was COVID that really made me think about this as well, where I decided I needed to step out of the classroom. And I was fortunate to come across a project that Ecotricity, the renewable energy company, wanted to fund and get involved in education to help really support and create a sense of urgency around the climate nature emergency in schools. And the way that we sort of best thought about doing that was by pulling together all of the wonderful things that already exist So I think if anyone's sort of spent some time having a look, there's some amazing resources available from organizations. We've actually pulled together resources from nearly 200 different organizations. But one of the problems with those resources are that they're often buried on websites, they're sort of hidden, and it takes time and energy to be able to find those. And that's something that teachers are particularly short of. So in order to kind of support teachers, we weaved all of those resources from all these other organizations into a series of lessons that are aligned to the national curriculum. And what we thought is, in order to make this happen now, in order to fit within the frameworks that already exist, so not waiting for top-down reviews and curriculum change from governments, which is likely to take decades, saying actually, the urgency of this situation means we need to do as much as we can within any sphere of influence that we have. And in order to support teachers to have an impact within their own school communities, that was the way that we best saw that. What we've done actually is map that into a bigger journey so that it supports schools to make the best use of all of the great opportunities and resources around energy and food and transport and water, and actually to rationalize, I guess, is the kind of language that we're using, because I think it can be overwhelming. I think for schools, increasingly on a day-to-day basis, they're being asked to do more and more with a diminishing amount of resource. And anything that anyone can do to help support in that situation, I think teachers are hopefully very thankful for. So we were positioning ourselves almost as an umbrella to help provide support and assistance. And we've had a really interesting journey. We started off about a year and a half ago working with a handful of primary schools, and we went through a really purposeful trial where we were measuring the impact in a really evidence-based way, because again, I think a lot of what goes on in the environmental education or the sort of climate space isn't necessarily the most evidence-informed and the most rigorous. And we were keen to make sure that we looked at the impact on nature connection, teachers' confidence, the sense of hope, and also the wider community impact, because I think also one of the opportunities here is to re-emphasize schools as a catalyst within their local community, and for them to be able to engage with wider society. And partly that's through teachers as trained educators, communicators, and people who are perfectly equipped to engage with audiences. I always find it funny when I go visit places with maybe university academics talking to an audience, and the nature and the way that they engage with an audience is quite different to the way that someone who's been trained as a teacher. I think teachers really are very special people in being able to adapt and engage. And a lot of those words that Alison was talking about in terms of empathy and being able to really persist maybe as well is another good one with audiences. And I think all of that comes to help support the way that we can engage around this sort of the climate and nature emergency. I think I might stop there. Shall I hand back to you, Alison?
Thank you. Well, I totally agree that teachers are wonderful people. So you've won my heart. I should have said I'm a white woman. I've been teaching a long time, so I've got grey hair, and I'm wearing a dark blue jacket and some beautiful pearls, actually. I'm now going to hand over to Temi Akindele-Barker from Inclusion Labs, when she's going to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her work. Thank you, Temi.
Thank you, Alison. Hi, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here. Just to give a bit of a description, I am a Black woman. I have long brownish black braids that fall past my shoulders, and I am wearing some gold hoops and a blue jumper, a dark blue jumper. Great to be here. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to talk about two things that are intrinsically linked to each other, but at the same time, I think are kind of the missing piece sometimes in what is otherwise, a full curriculum or a full experience or educational experience. I am the founder of Inclusion Labs, and what we do really is we go into schools and we partner with schools and support them to measure and improve their DEI impact. So for us, that's diversity, that's equity, and that's inclusion. So again, speaking about diversifying the curriculum kind of sits firmly where we stand. We are very much a data-driven organization, so we really believe that before any school creates elaborate action plans or strategies, and this might not necessarily just be in terms of across the school, but in terms of maybe even areas such as curriculum or wherever else, that you should first find out who's in your community, and that should be your starting point. So really what we're trying to get schools to do is to interrogate their processes, their policies, and their practices. And I think that's a really important thing, especially in light of what we're talking about tonight. You know, one of the things that we talked about in a meeting the other day was this idea of interrogation and how questions are where creativity comes to life, you know, and that's where it all starts. It starts from a question. And so for schools, it starts from questioning, who are we? Who is within our walls? Who's in our community? And from that, getting creative and using that as a launch pad to, whether it's diversify your curriculum, whether it's to create initiatives or whatever else. Whilst we don't necessarily create content in terms of things that are going to be accessible, let's say, to the students in the classroom, what we're trying to do is guiding schools to build a framework that allows them to have a right balance between that rigor and that structure in terms of planning, but then also within that, the space to have the freedom to try something new. My frustration as a founder of Inclusion Labs, but just in general, even as a parent to two beautiful daughters, is there's a lot of repurposing of old ideas. And I think that's because there's a lot of fear around this area, particularly when it comes to diversifying things or approaching diversity. And actually, I think what we want to try and empower schools to do is to feel excited about something like this and to feel free to try. One of the things we're always saying to teachers and educators in our program is, you don't necessarily have to teach about everything. Part of that learning journey, part of being creative might be sitting on the floor with your students and learning alongside them. So in essence, that's what we do. We encourage and empower and encourage schools to improve their impact across, I guess, inclusivity, diversity, and be equitable. So looking at who they have and adjusting it accordingly.
Oh, wonderful. We love the idea of teachers being empowered. That's fantastic. And in fact, the Chartered College of Teaching has a whole series of online webinars about diversification and decolonisation of the curriculum. So if it's an area that you are feeling nervous about, worried that you might say the wrong thing, so you're better off saying nothing, you know, that's not a solution either. So do think about engaging with some of those webinars. They're completely free to members. So thank you very much, Temi. We're going to have a bit of a chat now around all kinds of issues. I've got some questions, if that's all right. So I'm going to come back to you to start with, Paul, just to give Temi a few seconds of a break. What does making space for work on the climate look like for you?
I think it's sort of, there's many strands to this, because I think one of the ones that jumps out first of all for me is the space within the classroom for the conversation, to not, I think this has already been said, maybe Alison as well, that idea of not shutting down these sorts of conversations and actually opening them up. This is an interesting space in the sense that there are not necessarily right answers. Instead, it's important to ask questions and explore and to think about the kind of thoughts and ideas and opinions that someone might have, and to be able to understand the difference and kind of explore those and how people's ideas might differ. The other one I wanted to say as well is that I think what's really interesting is to understand the climate and nature emergency as this intersectional kind of crisis, and actually how all of these aspects are linked. And I think one of the false ways that people can think they are giving space to this is by placing it within a subject like science or geography and compartmentalizing it and saying, as long as we learn the right facts or knowledge, we can teach our way out of this. And I think that's a false sort of approach. Instead, to really address these sorts of things and give space, we need to be open, inquisitive, and acknowledge the sort of unknowns, which can be quite a scary place for teachers, because often also it means, in terms of planning series of lessons that are quite open-ended, where there's uncertainty about where it might go. and actually leaving that open to the students to almost give the direction. So as a teacher, yes, still being the person in control and facilitating and guiding and being the sort of expert in the sense of knowing how to be able to bring in resources and stimulus, but actually allowing the students the space to be able to ask the questions that are relevant for them, and to explore. And actually, I think a lot of the time it's something that teachers can't necessarily second guess. And that often teachers are surprised. You know, there's always anecdotes like this of a teacher teaching a certain topic and saying, this child asked this question, and you would never think they would ask that question. And I do think that that's often within these spaces, we can't necessarily second guess the circumstances of all our students' lives and the experiences they've had. And part of what makes teaching such a rich experience is bringing those experiences together and giving those experiences space, and sort of bringing those to life.
So it is about being comfortable with uncertainty, isn't it? It's about being able to set up situations where the children may debate something, a bit like philosophy for children, you know, where you've got a curated conversation, but it's open-ended. And I think what you're talking about, really getting to know the children, really resonates, I would imagine, with what Temi would say that she would be talking about. So in terms of your work, Temi, how do you help people to see that there's space to have these conversations within a crowded curriculum?
I think it's several ways. I think, you know, the heart of what we do is, you know, who are we, so as a school? And literally meaning, you know, who is within our community and across our community. But then who are we in terms of our mission and our ethos and our values? And because they're very much linked, you know. I always say this in tongue in cheek, I've never met a school that doesn't claim to be inclusive, you know. So again, it's about remembering that claim that you have, those values, those missions that you have, actually have to become something tangible. It has to live and breathe in your curriculum, in every aspect of your school. So I think it's about a good and a safe starting point is, who are we? Who do we have amongst us? And that's a very safe way to start in terms of approaching this. But then another thing, I guess maybe this next step is, you know, well, who's missing? Who's missing from these stories? And that might be perhaps people that we don't, or identities that we don't have within our school community, or the stories that we're encountering, you know, and who's missing from that. And looking at it strategically, whether you're a subject lead, and looking at your curriculum and saying, you know, well, whose story or whose perspective are we not telling here? And then I think the third part is, again, which is tied to the first one, which is in terms of being reflective of who we are as a school community, then taking it a bit wider. How is what we're talking about reflective of our local community? How is what we're talking about or teaching reflective of global society? So again, I think it's not about trying to jump to these big, high-level topics. Just start from who you are and use that to work your way outwards and to, you know, to explore deeper and wider. And I think that's, for me, I think it's a smart way to do it. I've got some fantastic examples. I mean, I think there was a school on our program, and this was a primary school, I think, where some of the data from our audit, you know, showed who was, I guess, the question of who we are as a community, who's within our walls. And this particular teacher decided, one of the teachers decided that she was going to change one of her topics. And it was going to be, I think it was early Islamic civilization, because she felt actually, from looking at the data of who our students are, this was really reflective of quite a big proportion of them, and this might be something that would connect them on a personal level. So again, I don't think that teacher would have felt safe and courageous enough to have taken that leap without actually first looking at who is in her classroom and starting from there. But I think, again, it's about giving people the courage, the ability to be courageous and to go, do you know what? Actually, in my classroom or in this year or in this school, there are X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank. Let's start there and then work our way.
So you mentioned a teacher on your program. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means? For what do you do? How does it all work?
So we go into schools, and in the first instance, we audit or survey the whole school community. So again, I think one of the things that we talk about as an organization is a school community is made up of everyone, not just the staff, not just the students. So depending obviously on whether it's a primary or secondary school, we audit the students, the parents, the teachers, teaching and non-teaching or support, and all the way up through to the governors. We ask some demographic questions, so how do you identify? And one of the things we say is, tell us who you consider yourself to be. And that's a really important part. So for example, I may consider myself to be Black British, but you may look at me and say that I'm Black African. So again, it's about, but actually at the point in which we are meeting at this school in this environment is how I see myself. So we ask some demographic questions, and we ask some questions across the school system, about how they feel about certain things, again, under that umbrella of diversity and inclusion. And we are able to then present back to the schools, this is who your community says they are across these different stakeholder groups, and this is how they feel about the different touch points of your school. So again, it's a really very broad survey that we ask, with the primary school pupils. It's wonderful because we facilitate something called a chalk talk, which is more age appropriate. And again, talking about diversifying curriculum and empowering even the students, you will have these primary age students will create this chalk talk, which is an exercise where you might have an overarching question. What does diversity look like? What does diversity feel like? What does diversity sound like? To us as adults, we kind of go, well, what does that mean? But for children, you give them a pen and they go up onto that chalkboard and they write all sorts of things. And some of it is very, yes, well, that makes sense. Some of it is beautifully out there, but it's their response to that. And then you use that to ascertain, okay, well, where are we in terms of knowledge gaps and awareness and so on and so forth. It's very hard to synthesize it, but it's doing lots of different things depending on the age and the stakeholder group to really get a feel for where we are as a school and where that starting point. So for example, with the chalk talk, that's a really popular way that our teachers in our program then utilize as a starting point for addressing lots of other complex topics that perhaps may be a little bit nerve-wracking. Have a chalk talk, be with your students. What does that word feel like, sound like, seem like, taste like even, and then use that as a springboard. So it's really, I think, you see the best and the worst of humanity in terms of whether it's just, a lack of knowledge and you think, how can you not know? But at the same time, you then see, students knowing so much more about certain things than even the adults in a setting. But again, it's because they're not bound by the restrictions that I think we are, especially in this area where it feels very emotive.
And as you say, it's open-ended. A word like diversity, what does it mean to you and how do you respond to it? I mean, similarly, Paul, words like sustainability and climate crisis, I mean, without terrifying generations of students, and I don't think that's what you'd be about at all. How do you work with schools? What does your intervention look like?
It's really interesting. We kind of have a very similar approach in the sense that we begin with a really holistic sense of the community, and we've got some questionnaires and some surveys, including this Nature Connection Index, which is just a series of 5 sentences that everyone within the school community, including the governors and all of the staff, score themselves on. It gives you a value between 0 and 100, which kind of measures your relationship with the rest of nature. But it's that sense of saying, actually, in order for these things to really be truly sustainable, it has to be the whole community together from the very beginning. It can't be something that's sort of top-down implemented. I think that's always set to fail. We need to bring people along in a journey, and that's something we really aim to do. As well as these sorts of surveys which explore, and questionnaires which explore people's perception of the words and the language, again, because it's all about having a common vocabulary to be able to describe and understanding what someone means by a certain term. And also, I guess, exploring some of the misconceptions and some of the language which actually has very little meaning. I know a word like sustainability has now become ubiquitous and is just everywhere, and you wonder, actually, does it have any meaning? But in terms of our journey, what we then do is support schools to map their physical space, to look at the school grounds and explore how they can use the school grounds as a resource that can then be connected with the curriculum, so that rather than it being someone's additional responsibility to look after a garden space tucked away around the corner, that's actually linked to a certain topic that a year group is doing, and it creates sustainability in terms of the management of that space. Schools also then map their curriculum. And I think often schools are surprised how much sustainability they have woven across their curriculum. You know, it might be in English where teachers are looking at Greta Thunberg's speeches and looking at the language and the sort of rhetoric within those. And obviously there's more direct links within geography or science, but I think it's across the curriculum. People would be surprised how much they're already doing. And what we then try and do is help support developing the links and connections and opportunities to start building and developing more and sort of connecting more elements to that.
So you're essentially providing that scaffolding so that teachers have a commitment to looking at everything that they're teaching. And is this across primary and secondary schools?
Yeah, so we were primary focused last year, and now we've shifted to secondary. And what's interesting with secondary is obviously at primary level, what we're trying to promote as well is that cross-curricular nature, because we're saying actually the real world is not in subject silos. And so primary teachers are far more comfortable with that. And what we've done is pull together a series of lessons where there's an element of English, an element of maths. And what we've also found is that feels far more genuine for young people, using the environment as the context for their learning. Often young people understand that far better than some sort of abstract idea. But in terms of shifting this to the secondary level at Key Stage 3, what we've got are inquiry questions that are really short, thought-provoking questions like, is carbon a magic ingredient? Or who's really in charge is a really interesting one. I used to love going into schools and people just saying the Queen, and you'd say, well, technically, you know, maybe, but not quite. But those questions at the secondary level are shared across subject areas. So you have 2 or 3 subjects, and that really helps to encourage more sort of systems thinking in a way, and the students are exposed to the response to a question from multiple disciplines. So yes, the subjects are really strong and they bring their subject knowledge and their discipline to answering this question. But the young people understand how, as a mathematician, this is how you would start thinking about that, and the way that you would start to answer that question, whilst as a geographer, you're looking at it from a different scale or perspective. And I think that's really a sort of rich experience for young people to have a learning experience that is more genuine to the real world, and the way that they, particularly with these sorts of crises and situations that we're experiencing, the sorts of thinking that we need rather than a very siloed approach.
Yeah, I can see how that could begin to work really powerfully. In terms of student voice, then, both of you are talking about ways of working in the classroom that encourage youngsters to think critically, to suggest their ideas, and to work things through. I mean, you said, Temi, some of the ideas are quite out there. Creating the space for that kind of, that creative thinking and making new connections, that can be potentially quite uncomfortable for teachers who feel that they need to have everything sort of tied down and have their learning outcomes already predefined and so on. How do you, Temi, if I come to you first, how do you encourage teachers to create more space for student voice?
That's the big question in my job. So at the heart, one of our 6 key tenets is about being student-led and having a student-led approach, both as an organization as well as encouraging schools to do that. And it's one of the difficult things because, like you said, people get very nervous, educators get very nervous, you know, oh, I don't know about bringing the students in at this level, or I don't know about incorporating that. And actually, I think the most successful schools in a program are the ones that kind of almost had to go, do you know what, let's trust in this and see what happens. And actually realizing that what they got out of it was far better than they could ever have imagined. Really, I think it's about making that space again. It's about giving them the opportunity to help you design that structure, to help you design that topic. You know, I think one of the schools, again, I'm trying to give examples, tangible examples of what we've seen. We had a school recently, I just spoke to them yesterday, where it's a secondary school, and they were trying to deal with some complex themes around diversity in their curriculum and how to address it, particularly as they were in Black History Month and so on and so forth. And so they threw it out to their students. And what the resulting was, it was a mixture of students coming in and making suggestions, such as one of them had read something about how Sainsbury's had done something, and they all went onto the internet and mapped out all these tweets from Sainsbury's and created this huge topic around about diversity in Black History Month, but using Sainsbury's adverts. But the kids or the students were engaged. You know, a lot of times I think when we think about diversifying the curriculum, we're thinking about, again, because we're just on the back of Black History Month, it's like, you know, the Martin Luther Kings and these very historical and storied stories, which absolutely they have a place to be told. But actually, you know, there's another school that we spoke about where their approach was to look at Stormzy. And actually a lot of these, I guess, maybe musicians that your students are listening to are speaking about the things that you're trying to teach, are telling you the stories through their music. So bringing that in is a great way of engaging and using your students' voice. Who are you listening to? What are they telling you in their songs, in their stories? And then critically assessing it and having, you know, I think those are really good ways of empowering your students. To empower them, you have to engage them. To engage them, you have to empower them. It goes hand in hand. And so it can either be something that is, you know, closely linked together, or else it becomes this vicious cycle. And I think the best way you can engagement is to meet them where they are. Meet them where they are, and then go on that journey together. You know, give them the opportunity, get them to have a process. One of the things we talk about is having a process for this. What is your process for getting recommendations from your students? What is the process that you have in place to get recommendations from the parents? Because everybody's got great ideas. They just want to know that they're empowered to share them, that they're allowed to share them, you know, that they're encouraged to share them. And I think that's, for me, is really at the heart of getting that student voice out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having spent my whole career as a teacher and then subsequently as a head teacher, I can't actually understand how you can teach without engaging the learners, and how you can teach without listening to their ideas and creating a climate for dialogue. Coming to you, Paul, in your teaching career, when you were a geography teacher, did you engage student voice, or is that something that you've become more aware of as you've taken this agenda further forward?
No, I think I always have. I mean, I was just going to touch on one thing that Temi was saying there about, I think there's often with the curriculum and with teachers, there's almost this distance between the curriculum and what teachers use and create, and maybe where we are in the world today. And I think part of what we're talking about is trying to reduce that and make the materials and context of what is being used in a classroom a bit more relevant, and actually having a relevancy to young people. You know, the example you're talking about, Sainsbury's and Stormzy. I know, so in my teaching, there's an artist called MIA who created some really incredible music videos. And some of those were really good starting points for conversations around migration, and all kinds of really contemporary issues. And I always enjoyed starting a lesson with a video that was something that the students just didn't expect at all. And I thought that was always an interesting way to catch them almost off guard, and to break down lots of the barriers of the preconceptions of what they thought when they were coming into a classroom, what they were expecting. And I understand you can't do that every time, but in terms of student voice, it's always been a really key part. And I think it comes in also to what we're doing now in terms of developing agency and action with young people, because I think young people often feel like they're not heard and their voices aren't listened to. And particularly within these spaces, I think it's incredibly important. And I do know there's some cliches in terms of talking about young people's futures and, you know, the impacts being greatest on those. I think actually the reality is we are already seeing lots of these impacts and experiencing it today. But what we can do through teaching in certain ways and by structuring kind of education by emphasizing and developing the skills and the ability within young people to have a positive impact within the local community, I think that can be so empowering. And as a teacher, that was often the thing that got me most excited, was to actually teach young people in a way that made them realize their own agency and their ability to have a positive impact on the world. So many people, I think, go through school thinking life is something that happens sort of to them. It's a conveyor belt, and they just sort of jump on, and there's an expectation that they follow a certain path. And I think some of the best educators actually show young people the agency and the ability that they have to have an impact on the world. And so one way we do that through the Ministry of Eco-Education is each of these topics, each of these inquiry questions has some sort of real world outcome. So we're encouraging schools to either the students produce something that has meaning beyond the classroom and beyond that single teacher. So it's something that can be shared with the wider community, or they're actually hosting some sort of event and bringing people into the school, or hosting it in a community space that then actually the learning feels more genuine, has an impact within the wider community.
I was just thinking about, sorry to interrupt, Alison, I was just thinking kind of what you were saying. And again, another great thing that I came across recently was there was this resource, I think, that was shared that someone had posted somewhere, and so one of the teachers had shared it with me, and it was about how you can walk from Cape Town to Russia, or you can get from Cape Town to Russia by walking without having to use any type of transportation. And so this teacher took that, you know, kind of came across and thought, wow, that's amazing. Took that into their classroom, then had a bowl, and in the bowl it had things like history, music, food, weather, you know, all sorts of themes. And I think the idea was then they had a project where they had to do the walk from Cape Town to Russia, and then a student would pick out, and then you'd have to, then that would be the theme. What is the food in this location we're in? What's the climate going to be? And I just thought it was a really creative way of, again, this idea of it wasn't just about one set thing. What is the currency? You've got maths there, you've got geography there, you've got, you know, sustainability, you've got all of these other things. And it was a fun way of engaging the students, giving them ownership. And, you know, and I think it's things like that, is that actually there are so many creative ways of even just things you encounter on a day-to-day and going, well, what would that look like if I brought that into the classroom? And there's no set structure. I'll just give a couple of little headers and see where that conversation takes me. So I think kind of following off what Paul was saying about just trying to engage them with a lot of breadth and mixed media and different, you know, different types of ways of learning, I think is just, for me, very inspirational.
And also it illustrates all the connections that we have. We're all connected, aren't we? That's a wonderful example. Now, look, we're coming close to the end of our discussion. If you have some questions, please do post them in the chat or in Q&A, because we'll be picking those up from you in a moment. But before we do that, I'd just like to ask both of you, if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, well, it's all very well, but how do we start? What would you suggest as a great, easy starting point that doesn't feel too complex, doesn't feel like you've got to throw the whole curriculum away and just open everything up and just go, hey kids, just tell me, where would you start? Let's begin with you, Temi.
Great question. Two parts to the answer. One part would be, who's in your school? Start there. What stories do they have? And those can then become the themes for which you can kind of further explore. But I guess that's the obvious answer because we're a data-led organization. But I think the second thing that I would say is pretty much every school, primary and secondary, are very much reliant on diversity calendars. Now, whilst I really want schools to go further than that, you know, you'll never see Inclusion Labs talk about Black History Month because we believe it should be every day and things like that. But I do understand in terms of a starting point, that's a good way to start. But don't just pick a date or an event. Pick a date and event and do it one day, pick a date and event and see how you can stretch that over a term. See how you can stretch that over a year. Take that to all the subject leaders, see how they can stretch that. How does that look when you're thinking about your assemblies? How does that event look when you're thinking about your guest speakers? What does that look like in history? So I would then either use your school community as a starting point or go to one resource that everybody uses, a diversity calendar, but extend it. Make each event or each date or each celebration across the curriculum. Challenge yourself to find that connection and connect those dots across every touch point of your school, and see if you can do that. How far across a school can you do that in a term?
Okay, that's a good start for you. Let's come to you, Paul. Where do we start?
I think as a classroom teacher, there's so much you can do within your own classroom before you've even had conversations with anyone else. I think the language that you use within your classroom, in most schools, you've got the freedom to use the language that you think is most appropriate, and being conscious of that and using terms and language and talking about the meaning of those words can be really effective. It's also the imagery you use. I think it's really important that you are conscious of lots of the maybe the global north or the sort of wealthy Western perspective that we perpetuate inadvertently, so kind of without any thought. And if you're aware of that, and there's some really good sources, so one of them is called Climate Visuals, is a really good source of a more varied imagery that you can use. And I guess, as a geographer, we often use case studies and talk about examples. Being conscious of the examples and the stereotypes that we are perpetuating and challenging those is a really important part as well of that. Moving beyond the classroom, in terms of planning, there's always the opportunity to look at what you already teach and think, is there a topic that we can connect with an aspect of this? Can we draw out the climate or a certain kind of idea within that? And that's where then the resources that we've pulled together would really help a school to do that, because they can sort of look at the menu of things that we've got and they can say, okay, well, we'll pull this one and we'll start doing that. I think with so much of this, it's important to take a first step, because then that gets the journey going, and you take small steps and it builds. I think so much of what stops people is that sense that it's just too big, it's too much for me, and particularly with everything else that's going on. And I do feel like lots of the barriers that we put in place are almost a self-imposed. I do think schools, there's so much more scope to engage with these ideas in schools. And actually, when you start looking at this, you realize how it connects with things like Ofsted and intent. And there's so many ways to weave these ideas into what you do as a school in order to bring in and do more of this.
Response?
I can start. So for us, that's one of the things we're trying to actively encourage schools to do. So one of our 6 key tenets is expansive perspective and diverse experts or specialists, and that kind of goes hand in hand. And one of the things about kind of connecting to your local community is that there are individuals and organizations and grassroots groups that are literally at your doorstep that would love the opportunity to be in front of your staff, to be in front of your students, to talk about their work. This is what we do on a day-to-day. This is what we see. This is what we experience, So again, bringing that subject in and then kind of taking out, that's something we're actively in our framework. That's one of the standards that we ask, how are you connecting to local society, to local communities? Have you, for example, reached out to local organizations, community-led, grassroots? Again, I think it's a really strong antidote to the fear and the nervousness. You don't always have to teach everything. You don't have to be the expert. Bring these experts in. Let them tell it to your schools, to your teachers, to your students, and then take it from there. So absolutely, we encourage schools to do that. Many schools are beginning to do that, but we want to see more of that for sure.
Yeah, similarly, I would reiterate exactly that. We've had some interesting stories with sort of fashion topics where there's been parents involved in so clothing industry who've come on board and sort of come along and done a lesson or a workshop or something. I think again, this is how we return to schools as being the center of a community, is by inviting in as many people as possible. And that also exposes young people to another group of people. And again, that also is the intergenerational idea as well. When you start to bring people who of different ages and different, backgrounds. The other thing I would say is that we're just launching something called the Young Green Britain Challenge, which is all about supercharging social action within local communities. And we're developing, this is for Key Stage 3 secondary schools, working with a variety of schools across the country, where we're really focusing on helping young people to have a positive impact in their local area by coming up with an idea and turning that into action. And we're sort of providing the training and some seed funding to make that happen. But a key component of that is connecting some mentors from local businesses and other social action groups as well, to share their experience and I guess kind of help amplify the action.
I think that's going to be the most impactful way. It's, they shouldn't just hear about whether it's diversity, they need to experience it. You shouldn't just, again, thinking about how to engage them. Well, let's take it out of the books and out of the tables and actually make it come alive in the classroom. So absolutely, I think more schools can connect to their local communities and people that are doing this work or at the forefront of these issues, the better. I think in the first part, which I got, which is how do parents respond to the data gathering? I think it's a mixed bag. Sometimes the parents, I think generally in our schools, the parents are the hardest to engage at the forefront at the first instance. But then what we then find is that it spikes up after the data is revealed, because I think there's a lot of, well, what are you actually going to do? Are you just going to ask us more questions and nothing's going to happen? And then when they see that we present this data that feels very authentic and transparent and true to who their community is, and that we're not only just presenting this data to schools, but we're actually linking the data to the touch points of a school. So we have a framework with impact areas, and each impact area is everything from guest speakers, assemblies, curriculum, so on and so forth. And we're actually mapping that data so that we're guiding schools in, okay, where do we interrogate based on what the parents have said or the students have said, and so on and so forth. And I think that builds the trust. So generally, I think quite rightly, there is a lot of survey fatigue. And so there's a lot of mistrust, well, is this actually going to do anything? Is generally the first response we get from parents. But then I think afterwards, because schools are on our program are having to be committed, there's a lot of accountability built into that. Parents then begin to see them actually actioning, as like we say, turning intent into action. And then that builds the trust, that builds the transparency, and it kind of goes from there. So I didn't hear the second part, but I think that answered the first part.
Can I jump in as well? Because parents is an interesting one in terms of a climate perspective, because I think a lot of the time parents will jump straight to the idea of quite radical action. And they'll think, if you're going to engage my child in these sorts of ideas, are they going to end up, I don't know, sort of sitting in front of a car or going on some sort of march? And I think what we have found the best way is to sort of involve parents in understanding the curriculum, exposing them to it. And we've ran some really interesting events in schools where children have shared what they've learned through a day of learning. They've created some materials and content. That might have been poems or songs, and then they've performed those to the parents, and they've seen and experienced that. And actually, universally, what we've found is the parents have been really thankful and have enjoyed and gained so much from that experience. Because I think also exploring both of these ideas offers up an opportunity as well to kind of engage parents in the school process, in education as a whole. I think what you'll often find is parents are almost disengaged often because of their own experience, and they bring with them that kind of, it's an almost baggage. And I think as much as we can do, I guess again it's another sort of burden, or it's another sort of aspect to this, but to engage parents is such an important part as well.
But sorry, very quickly on that as well, what you will also find is that the parents that really have something to say but don't know how to say it or where to say it, we get those parents. So we will verbatim get, this is the only place I can say this, and then they will share something also. So again, it's about giving that space, because actually questioning whether you'd probably assume, well, of course you'd be able to ask any question, you're a parent. But actually, that's not always the case. So a lot of times with engagement, what you'll find is those that really have something that they really want to share with the school, but maybe don't have the confidence to, or feel paranoid, or if you are the only Black parent, for example, how do you vocalize something that seems very personal to you? So giving them the space to do that, allowing them the space to do that, I think is a really important part of engaging them, particularly those that are maybe not as represented as others.
Thank you so much to Alison, to Paul and to Temi for giving us such insightful answers. If there is anyone who would like to find out a bit more about the work that you do, is your website, is that the best place for them to look to find out a bit more about the work that you're doing? So if you want to visit Ministry of Eco-Education and Inclusion Labs, you can find out more information about their work there. So thank you so much for joining us today. And if you're interested in finding more about Teaching for Creativity and the programme that we run, we have a wealth of resources on our website. We have taster cards, we have lesson resources. We've got another webinar that's on our website as well. It's all free to access. So please visit our website to find out more information or get in contact with us. And you can also sign up for our school's newsletter as well.